Mom, if we eat now, how will we visit Dad in prison?
We'll figure it out, sweetie. We always. Your dad was here right now. He would not let his little angels suffer.
The diner smelled like coffee and fried onions, but the air felt thinner than it should. Not the kind of quiet that comes from peace, but the kind that settles when someone speaks a truth too painful to ignore. A young mother sat motionless at a corner booth, staring at 12 crumpled dollars in her palm. Bills she'd already counted 3 times, hoping the math would somehow change. Across from her sat 2 children with hopeful eyes and growling stomachs, and 3 tables behind them. Leather and steel commanded the room in a way that made strangers look away. When the question finally came, whispered, innocent, devastating, it shattered something in the space between them. "Mom, if we eat now, how will we visit Dad in prison?" In that instant, time fractured. Breaths caught. Silverware stopped mid-air. And the man everyone feared most, scarred knuckles, gray beard, eyes that had seen war, felt his chest tighten with a recognition he'd buried for 12 years. This is a story about impossible choices that children shouldn't have to make. About the moment a hardened soul remembers who he used to be. About how one whispered question can crack open a heart sealed shut by regret, and change 2 families forever. Before we dive into this incredible story, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I love seeing how far this channel reaches. And if you enjoy powerful emotional stories with real-life lessons, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. The cold pressed against the windows like it wanted in. Late afternoon light filtered through glass streaked with old rain, casting everything in shades of gray. The diner was nearly empty. Just a handful of people scattered across worn booths, eating quickly, heads down, wanting nothing more than to finish their meals and disappear into the warmth of wherever home was. For Tasha Saint, there was no rushing anywhere. Every moment here was borrowed time, a brief escape from the small apartment that felt smaller every day, its walls closing in with unpaid bills and unanswered questions. She sat perfectly still, hands wrapped around $12 that felt both impossibly heavy and weightlessly inadequate. She had been strong for so long. Months of it. Ever since Marcus went away. Armed robbery, a crime born of desperation, committed in a moment of panic that he'd regretted before the judge's gavel even fell. Now he was 3 hours away in a facility that might as well have been on another planet, and every visit required calculations that never quite added up. Bus fare, timing, food for the kids, gas money borrowed from her sister who barely had enough herself. The math of poverty was relentless. It followed her everywhere, whispered in her ear at night, greeted her every morning. Add, subtract, divide what little there was into even less. $12. She turned the bills over in her hands, feeling the soft wear of money that had passed through too many desperate fingers before landing in hers. This was supposed to last until Friday when her paycheck from the cleaning service would finally clear. But the kids were hungry, really hungry, the kind that made Caleb's hands shake slightly when he reached for the menu. And it was only Tuesday. Amara watched her mother's face with eyes that had learned to read between the lines, to decode the silences, to understand the careful way Tasha moved through the world. At 9 years old, she understood sacrifice in ways children shouldn't. She'd learned to be small, to need less, to make herself easy. Caleb, only 6, still believed in simple solutions. If you're hungry, you eat. If you want something, you ask. He didn't yet grasp the complex equations poverty created, the impossible arithmetic that turned every meal into a negotiation with an uncertain future. The menu sat between them like an accusation. Pancakes, burgers, grilled cheese. Things that used to be simple suddenly felt like luxuries reserved for people who didn't have to choose between feeding their children today and seeing their father tomorrow. "We can order water," Tasha said quietly, forcing brightness into her voice the way she'd learned to force everything. Smiles, hope, the pretense that things were okay. We had a big breakfast, remember? They hadn't. The lie was familiar, worn smooth by repetition. Caleb's face fell slightly, but he nodded because he'd learned that arguing made his mother's eyes look sadder. Amara said nothing at all, just reached across the table and took her little brother's hand, holding on like she could keep them all from falling apart through sheer will alone. Amara thought about the letters hidden in her backpack, tucked carefully between her math homework and a library book she'd already read twice. 3 of them, written in her father's careful handwriting, the kind that slanted slightly to the right, each letter formed with deliberate precision, as if taking extra time with the words might make them reach farther across the distance between them. He always started the same way, "To my beautiful girl" or "To my brave son." The words themselves were simple. He asked about school, about whether Caleb was remembering to brush his teeth, about what books Amara was reading. He told them he was proud. He told them he was learning to be better, taking classes, reading, thinking about the man he wanted to be when he came home. But it was the end of every letter that broke something inside Amara, the same words repeated like a prayer or a promise or both. "I'm counting the days until I see you. Love, Dad." They visited once a month. That's all Tasha could manage. Scraping together bus fare from tips and borrowed dollars, packing sandwiches the night before because the vending machines at the prison charged $3 for stale crackers, making the 3-hour journey on a Greyhound that smelled like diesel and desperation. They'd sit in a visiting room painted the color of old bones, where guards watched from corners and time limits felt designed to hurt, to remind everyone that connection was a privilege that could be revoked at any moment. But those visits mattered more than anything. They were the thread keeping their family from completely unraveling, the proof that they still existed as something whole even when the world insisted they were broken. Last visit, Caleb had climbed into Marcus's lap, something he wasn't technically allowed to do, but the guard had looked away, pretending to check his clipboard. Marcus had held his son like he was oxygen, his face pressed into Caleb's hair, and Tasha had watched them both with tears she refused to let fall until the bus ride home, until the kids were asleep against her shoulders and the darkness outside the window gave her permission to break. "Next month, baby," she'd promised when they left, when Marcus had kissed their foreheads through the narrow window of a loud affection. "We'll see Dad next month." But now, staring at $12 and 2 hungry children, she realized that promise might be the first one she'd have to break. The bus fare alone was $28 round trip. She'd been saving, adding $1 here when she could skip coffee, another there when she walked instead of taking the bus to work. She was almost there. $23 saved, hidden in an envelope taped behind the bathroom mirror where desperation couldn't find it. Almost. But almost didn't feed children who'd skipped lunch. Almost didn't quiet the way Caleb's stomach had been growling since they left school. Almost didn't erase the careful way Amara had stopped asking for things, had learned to make herself smaller, to need less, to carry the weight of understanding that childhood should have kept from her shoulders. The bell above the diner door chimed, and the temperature seemed to drop. Not literally, the door closed quickly enough, but something shifted in the air, the way it does when a storm rolls in before you can see the clouds. 3 men walked in. Leather vests worn soft with years and miles. Heavy boots that announced each step against the linoleum. The kind of presence that made conversations pause mid-sentence, made forks hover between plate and mouth, made people suddenly find their coffee fascinating. Hell's Angels. Their patches told stories written in thread and loyalty. Brotherhood territory, a life lived on the margins of polite society where the rules were different and mercy was earned, not given. Razor led them. He was in his 50s, built like someone who'd seen combat and come out harder for it, all sharp edges and controlled violence held barely in check. Former Marine, current member of a brotherhood most people feared without quite knowing why. His hair, gray-streaked and pulled back in a loose knot, framed a face weathered by sun and wind and regret that had carved itself into the lines around his eyes. Tattoos covered his arms, military insignia mixed with biker symbols, each one a story he no longer told. He looked like someone you didn't cross, didn't challenge, didn't even look at too long. The other two followed him to a booth near the back, moving with the ease of men comfortable in their own danger, men who'd stopped apologizing for taking up space a long time ago. They sat, stretched out, owned the corner they'd claimed. The waitress approached cautiously, her smile professional but distant, took their orders with minimal conversation, retreated. Smart. Keep it simple. Keep it quick. Tasha felt their presence before she saw them. Her shoulders stiffened, pulling inward like she could make herself invisible through sheer will. She didn't turn around. Some instincts ran deeper than curiosity. These weren't men to make eye contact with. These were men who operated in worlds she didn't understand and didn't want to. Worlds where violence was currency and weakness was something you couldn't afford to show. Amara glanced over her mother's shoulder, eyes widening slightly at the sight of leather and ink and the kind of masculinity that looked like it could break things without trying. Caleb started to turn, his 6-year-old curiosity stronger than caution, but Amara grabbed his hand gently, redirecting his attention with the practiced ease of a child who'd learned to read danger. "Look at the menu, Caleb," she whispered, pointing at the laminated pages between them. "See if they have chocolate milk." They didn't have money for chocolate milk, but Amara knew distraction when her mother needed it, knew when to create a different focus, a safer place to look. Behind them, Razor settled into the booth and picked up his fork. Just another meal. Just another day. Another diner in another town that all looked the same after a while. He had no idea that in the next few minutes, everything would change. Razor heard everything. In the Marines, you learned to be aware. Sounds, movements, threats approaching from angles you couldn't see. That awareness never left. Not after discharge, not after decades, not ever. It became part of your wiring, the way your body moved through the world. He'd heard the careful ordering, the practiced apology in the mother's voice, the gentle disappointment in the boy's question about pancakes. And now this, a child asking whether eating today meant not seeing her father tomorrow. The question hit him like a flashbang. Sudden, disorienting, devastating in its absolute clarity. Because he remembered asking a similar question once. Different words, same desperation underneath. Different decade, same math that never worked out. He'd grown up in a trailer park where food was never guaranteed, where dinner depended on which job his mother hadn't lost that week, whether the check had cleared, whether the landlord would wait another day. She worked 2 jobs and still came up short. He remembered the weight of adult decisions pressing down on his child-sized shoulders, remembered watching her count coins on the kitchen table, remembered the way she'd smile and say they were fine even when they weren't, even when the cupboards were empty and the electricity bill was overdue. He remembered understanding poverty before he understood math, knew hunger before he knew his multiplication tables. And he remembered the promise he'd made to himself, whispered in the dark of a bedroom he shared with 2 brothers. If I ever make it out, if I ever have money, if I ever have anything at all, I'll never let a kid go hungry. Never. But it was the mention of the father. In prison, counting days, writing letters, trying to stay connected from behind walls and wire, that truly destroyed him. Because Razor had a son. Somewhere. He didn't even know where anymore, didn't know if he was still in the same state, the same city, the same world that Razor occupied. 12 years ago, when the boy was 10, he'd asked, "Dad, are you coming to my game?" Razor had said yes. He'd meant it in that moment, had fully intended to show up. But then something came up, a club issue, an emergency ride, something that felt crucial at the time but whose details had long since faded into the blur of excuses and regrets. He didn't show. His son sat in the bleachers, scanning the crowd for a father who never arrived, who chose a motorcycle and Brotherhood over a little league game and a boy who needed him. The calls came less frequently after that. Then they stopped altogether. Razor told himself it was for the best, The kid deserved better than a biker dad with a record and a dangerous life. But the truth was simpler and uglier. He was scared. Scared of rejection. Scared of seeing disappointment crystallize into something permanent in his son's eyes. So he didn't try. And 12 years passed in silence. Now, listening to this little girl worry about her incarcerated father, Razor realized something brutal. The father behind bars was more present than he'd ever been. Razor stood up. The sound of his chair scraping against linoleum cut through the quiet diner like a blade. His two brothers looked up, confused, forks pausing mid-air. They'd been eating, joking quietly about the ride tomorrow, minding their business the way they'd learned to do in public spaces where their presence already said too much. Now their leader was standing, and his face carried an expression they rarely saw, one that didn't belong on a man who'd survived combat and street wars. Vulnerability. "Raz?" one of them asked, voice low and uncertain. He didn't answer. He was already walking, already moving toward something he couldn't name but couldn't ignore. Each step seemed louder than it should have been. Heavy boots on worn tile. The sound of inevitability approaching, of something that had been set in motion and couldn't be stopped. Other diners glanced up, then quickly away, the way people did when they sensed trouble but didn't want to become part of it. Tasha felt him before she saw him. The presence behind her grew stronger, closer, like a storm gathering. Her breath caught. Her instinct screamed the way it always did when danger approached. Protect the children. When Razor stopped beside their table, he was close enough that she could smell leather and motor oil and cold air still clinging to his vest, still carrying the outside world with him. She turned slowly, her body instinctively angling between him and her children, making herself a wall, a shield, whatever she needed to be. Up close, he looked exactly like what he was. Dangerous. Tattoos crawling up his neck, military insignia mixed with symbols she didn't recognize and didn't want to. Scars across his knuckles that told stories of violence. Eyes that had seen too much, that carried the weight of things decent people didn't witness. Tasha's heart hammered against her ribs. "Please," she started, her voice barely audible, already preparing to beg if that's what it took. "We're not causing trouble. We're just—" But then Caleb looked up. 6 years old, innocent, with eyes that held no fear. Only curiosity, only the wonder that came from still believing the world was mostly good. "Are you a real biker?" he asked, breaking through his hunger, making him forget for a moment that his stomach hurt. And something in Razor softened. Not his face. His face stayed hard, stayed carved from stone and regret, but something deeper, something essential that he'd thought had died years ago. He looked at Caleb, then at Amara, who was watching him with the kind of awareness that came from growing up too fast, from learning to read danger in the set of shoulders and the tone of voices. Finally, he looked at Tasha, really looked at her, past the fear and the exhaustion, and he saw himself. The desperation. The impossible choices. The fierce love battling against crushing circumstances and losing. Always losing. He reached into his jacket. Slow, deliberate, making sure his movements weren't threatening, weren't something she'd need to defend against. His hand emerged holding a thick leather wallet, worn soft by years and miles. Razor pulled out bills, not carefully selected, not counted with precision, but in a thick fold that spoke of someone who'd stopped worrying about money a long time ago, and placed them on the table between Tasha's trembling hands and her untouched water glass. "For the food," he said. His voice was gravelly, worn by years of shouting over motorcycle engines and wind, by decades of giving orders and living hard. But it wasn't harsh. It was tired in a way that suggested he'd been carrying something heavy for a very long time, something that had nothing to do with weight and everything to do with regret. Tasha stared at the money, then at him. Her mouth opened, closed. Words failed. Pride flared, the last defense she had left, the only thing poverty hadn't managed to steal yet. I can't. You can, Razor interrupted gently, his tone brooking no argument but carrying no judgment. And you will. He looked down at the children. Caleb's eyes were wide, filled with something between confusion and hope. Amara's were filling with tears she was trying desperately not to let fall, her small face fighting to stay composed the way she'd learned to fight everything. Your dad, Razor continued, his voice catching slightly on the word, stumbling over syllables that suddenly felt loaded with meaning. He's counting the days, yeah? Amara nodded, not trusting her voice, not trusting anything except the truth of what this stranger somehow understood. Then you make sure you're there. You understand. Family. He paused, the word feeling foreign and familiar all at once, like something he'd forgotten the meaning of and was only now remembering. Family should never struggle alone. Tasha shook her head, tears streaming now, all pretense abandoned. You don't understand. This isn't charity we need. This is. I know exactly what this is, Razor said, and his tone carried such weight that Tasha stopped mid-sentence, silenced by the certainty in his voice. I know what it's like to have to choose. I know what it's like when kids understand things they shouldn't have to understand. And I know what it's like to fail the people who needed you most. His jaw tightened. For a moment, the diner fell away, and it was just this. One broken person recognizing another, two souls who'd been shattered in different ways but understood the same language of loss. Take it, he said quietly. Order them real food. And next month, you use that bus money for the bus. You hear me? But how? You let me worry about that. Behind him, his two biker brothers had approached, standing a respectful distance back, their faces serious now, understanding without needing explanation. They'd heard enough. One of them nodded at Razor, a gesture of solidarity. The other cleared his throat and added quietly, We take care of our own. And anyone Razor says is worth helping is our own. The waitress reappeared, sensing something had shifted in the atmosphere, something profound she couldn't name but could feel. Razor turned to her. Change that order. Get these kids whatever they want. And dessert. Real dessert. He looked back at Tasha. It's not charity. It's just evening the score. Tasha covered her face with both hands. Her shoulders shook, years of carefully maintained composure collapsing all at once. Years of holding it together, of pretending she was strong enough, smart enough, capable enough to handle everything alone, shattered like glass hitting concrete. She'd been drowning for so long, treading water in an ocean that kept getting deeper, and she'd convinced herself that asking for help was the same as admitting defeat, the same as failing her children, the same as proving every judgment she'd felt from strangers was right. But here, in a diner that smelled like coffee and fried onions, with a stranger who looked like danger but spoke like someone who understood what it meant to carry impossible weight, she finally broke. I'm sorry, she sobbed, the words coming out raw and broken. I'm so sorry. I should be able to. Stop. Razor's voice was firm but not unkind, carrying the authority of someone who'd learned hard truths and refused to let others torture themselves with the same lies. You don't apologize for surviving. You don't apologize for loving your kids enough to make impossible choices. Amara and Caleb climbed onto the booth seat beside their mother, wrapping their small arms around her, pressing close in the way children did when the adult world became too heavy, whispering things only children could say to make pain feel lighter. It's okay, Mommy. We're okay, Mommy. Their voices are soft and fierce and absolutely certain. Razor stood there, awkward and uncertain, a man built for action suddenly paralyzed by emotion. His own eyes were suspiciously bright, reflecting light in ways that suggested tears he didn't know how to shed anymore. He'd spent decades building walls, around his emotions, around his heart, around anything that might make him vulnerable, might make him soft, might remind him of the man he'd been before the Marines, before the Brotherhood, before 12 years of silence taught him that feeling nothing was easier than feeling everything. But standing here, watching this family hold each other together with nothing but love and determination, those walls were crumbling. One of his brothers stepped closer and put a hand on Razor's shoulder. A silent acknowledgement, the kind that passed between men who'd ridden together long enough to speak without words. This matters. What you're doing here matters. When Tasha finally looked up, her face streaked with tears, mascara she couldn't afford to replace running in dark lines down her cheeks, she whispered, "Why?" Razor was quiet for a long moment, jaw working, fighting with words that didn't come easy. Then, "Because I have a son. And I haven't seen him in 12 years. And your husband, wherever he is still trying. He's still writing letters. He's still counting days. He's still being a father even when the whole world made it as hard as possible." He paused, swallowing hard against something sharp in his throat. "I walked away because it was easier. Your husband is fighting to stay close from behind bars. So yeah, this is why." 1 month passed. Tasha and her children stepped off the Greyhound bus at the prison parking lot, exactly on schedule. They'd made it. The money Razor gave them had covered not just that meal but groceries for 2 weeks, had given her room to breathe, to think beyond the immediate crisis of the next day. She'd been able to save, to plan, to feel something that almost resembled hope. But what she saw in the parking lot stopped her cold. 10 motorcycles, engine silent, parked in a neat line like soldiers at attention. And standing in front of them, Razor and his brothers, waiting. Tasha's hand flew to her mouth. Amara grabbed Caleb's hand, both of them staring, trying to make sense of something that seemed impossible. Razor stepped forward. He looked different in the daylight, older maybe, the gray in his beard more visible, but somehow softer too, like something inside him had shifted. What are you doing here?" Tasha managed, her voice barely working. "Making sure you get home safe," he said simply, as if driving 3 hours to meet a stranger's family was the most natural thing in the world. "You shouldn't have to worry about bus schedules and transfers and where your kids sleep tonight." One of his brothers stepped forward holding motel keys. "We got a room at the motel down the road. 2 beds, clean, paid for. So after your visit you can rest. And tomorrow we'll ride with you back home." Tasha couldn't speak, couldn't move. The world had tilted sideways and she didn't know how to stand in it anymore. Amara walked right up to Razor and wrapped her arms around his waist. "Thank you," she whispered into his leather vest. "Thank you for helping us see Dad." Razor's arms hesitated, hovering uncertain in the air, then came down around the little girl. He closed his eyes against tears he wasn't sure he remembered how to cry, feeling something crack open inside his chest that had been sealed for 12 years. Inside the prison visiting room, when Marcus saw his children walk through the door, he knew immediately something had changed. They looked different, not just fed but cared for. Supported. Amara was smiling. Caleb was bouncing. And Tasha's eyes didn't carry that edge of desperation he'd grown used to seeing. Tasha told him everything. About the diner. About Razor. About the Brotherhood that had decided family mattered more than anything. More than assumptions or judgments or the invisible line society drew between people who belonged and people who didn't. Marcus, a man who'd made terrible choices and paid dearly for them, who'd lost everything that mattered in one moment of desperation, wept openly. "Tell him thank you," he said, his voice breaking. Tell him I'll spend the rest of my life being worth that kindness." That night, in a motel room while Tasha and her children slept soundly for the first time in months, Razor sat outside on a curb. This time, he let it ring. "Hello." The voice was deeper than he remembered. A man's voice. His son was 22 now. "Hey." Razor's voice cracked. It's Dad. I know it's been too long. I know I don't deserve. Dad. 12 years of silence. And then, I've been waiting for you to call. 6 months after that first diner encounter, Razor stood in a prison visiting room. Not as a supporter this time. Not as the anonymous benefactor waiting in parking lots. As a visitor. His son had driven 3 hours to be there with him, to meet the family that had changed his father in ways he was still trying to understand. Marcus shook Razor's hand through the partition, his grip firm despite the barriers between them. You gave my kids hope, he said, his voice steady but thick with emotion. More than hope. You gave them a reason to believe good people still exist. Razor shook his head, uncomfortable with praise, with being seen as anything other than what he'd always been. Your kids gave me something more important. They reminded me it's never too late to be the person you should have been. Amara and Caleb pressed close to the glass, telling their father about school, about the new apartment Tasha had been able to move into with help from the Brotherhood's fund, about how they didn't have to choose between eating and visiting anymore. Their voices overlapped, excited, full of the kind of lightness children deserved but so often were denied. Tasha watched them all, her husband, her children, Razor, and the young man who looked so much like his father at hurt, and felt something she hadn't felt in years, belonging. Not just survival but actual connection to something larger than her own struggle. As they left the prison that day, Razor's son walked beside him instead of behind, their shoulders almost touching in the way of men still learning how to be close again. And for the first time in 12 years, Razor knew what it felt like to be a father again. Not the father he'd been, absent, scared, running from his own failures, but the father he should have been all along. Because sometimes the toughest men freeze when innocence reminds them who they used to be, when a child's voice cuts through years of armor and reaches the part of them they'd thought was dead. And sometimes a child's whispered question in a diner can crack open hearts sealed shut by regret, creating ripples of redemption that transform lives far beyond that single moment, touching strangers who become family, healing wounds that seemed permanent, proving that it's never too late to choose differently. This is how $12, 2 hungry children, and 1 impossible question turned judgment into compassion, estrangement into connection, and a hardened biker into a man who finally called his son. This is how 1 act of witness became an act of transformation. This is how family, blood or chosen, showed up when it mattered most. And in a small-town diner that still smelled like coffee and fried onions, where strangers still sat at worn tables making impossible choices, the story continued. Because kindness, once sparked, doesn't end. It spreads. It multiplies. It waits for the next person brave enough to see themselves in someone else's struggle and decide that today, right now, they're going to be the answer to a prayer someone was too afraid to speak out loud.
And that's it for today's video. If you enjoyed it or learned something new, make sure to hit that like button. It really helps support the channel. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. Drop your thoughts or questions in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.